chapter 24, section 4. Um, so the manors are what the farming communities were called. And so the manors were found on the fiefs, and the manors were owned by the nobles. And the nobles would choose people to run their manor. The seneschal looked after the nobles' fiefs and visited each of them regularly. The bailiff was the person who made sure that the peasants were working hard. And on each of the manors, there would be a court of law. And this is where people could settle their differences. This is where fines and punishments could be given out. This is where they could discuss the business of the manor. The manors were isolated from each other. They depended on themselves. The manor would make their own food, produce their own clothing. They built their own shelters. There weren't very many bridges. The roads weren't very good. And knights at war and thieves made traveling dangerous. So you kept to your own manor. And the noble would live in a wooden house or eventually a castle on the manor. And then there would be a village nearby with the peasants living in cottages. You would also find there'd be a church. They'd have a mill and a bread oven and a wine press. They had everything they needed on the manor. These cottages that the peasants lived in, these were one-room cottages. You would see there would be a table, some three-legged stools for furniture, maybe a bed, and maybe a storage chest. You might see straw on the floors, or it could be dirt floors. People and their animals, pigs, chickens, whatever, they slept in the cottage. So diseases and fleas were not uncommon. There were a lot of sick people due to these conditions. There's going to be two different groups of peasants. One group of peasants were called freemen. And freemen were peasants who paid the noble for the right to farm the land. And they worked only on their strips of land. And they do have some rights. They were free. They could move when they want. They could move where they want. And the noble could even throw them off his land. The other type of peasants were called serfs. And serfs were the nobles. They were a part of the property. The nobles' property included serfs. The serfs have very few rights. They can't move away. They can't own property. They have to get the nobles' permission if they want to marry. They also can't be kicked off the land. And they can't be forced to serve in the army. It was hard to gain your freedom from being a serf. You could try to escape to town. If you were able to escape for 1 year without being caught, you were free. Later on in the Middle Ages, serfs could actually save up and buy their own freedom. But usually serfs lived, worked, and died on the manor. They were even buried in the village churchyard, the village churchyard. They generally had no knowledge of the outside world. They worked long hours. They would work 3 days on the noble strips of land, and then 3 days on their own strip of land, so that way they could live as well. And they worked sunrise to sunset. They aged very quickly due to the hard work that they carried out day in and day out. Diseases would hit their homes. Kids would die quite often. They would have to pay to use the mill, to use the bread oven, to use the wine press in the village. Wild animals in the forest belonged to the Lord, so serfs couldn't even hunt the wild animals. There were some bright spots in a serf's life. Sunday, they didn't have to work. On Christmas, the Lord would provide them with a feast. There were some other holiday festivals throughout the year as well. When they could, they would try to play sports, soccer and wrestling and archery. But usually their life was dedicated to work. By the 1200s, people start to learn better farming methods to grow food. You would see the development of a two-field system. You would see a heavy iron plow being developed. This could break the soil that the lighter plow couldn't break. The horse collar was developed. Now you could actually use horses to plow. You didn't have to use slow-moving oxen. A village on the manor would contain between 15 to 30 families. And there would be many workshops besides the castle, besides the church. The manor produced almost everything needed for daily life. There were fields to raise a lot of different grains and other crops. You also had orchards. There were carpenters and stonemasons building things, blacksmiths to make knights' weapons and tools. You had women making fabric and clothing. You had the priests in the church. There were some goods that had to be gotten elsewhere, like salt and like iron. They started to learn that if you kept planting crops, the same crop year after year after year, the soil would start to lose its fertility. And they began using compost and manure to enrich the fields. But there never was enough fertilizer to go around. So farmers began using that two-field system. They would have one field kept fallow, meaning empty, and the other field would be planted. Next year, they would plant the fallow field and leave the other one empty. And each field would be divided into strips. Some of the strips were for the Lord, and some of the strips were for the serfs, even though the serfs worked all the strips. Not all fields were equally fertile, so that's why they divided it into strips. One single farmer could not handle the plowing and harvesting without help. The plow was heavy. Sometimes it took 8 oxen to pull the plow through the tough ground. And the serfs would share the oxen to plow, and they would help each other out at harvest. Work was done together. It was done cooperatively, but your family only received whatever your strips produced. Serfs did almost practically every ounce of work that was necessary on the manor. All in all, a serf would work about 3 days for the Lord, and the other 3 days would working so they could survive. Serfs were not allowed to leave the manor without the Lord's permission. Lords could even determine who a serf would marry. If you paid a fine, you could get out of it, but chances are, as a serf, you didn't have a lot of money. But here's the thing. Serfs weren't slaves. They did have rights. They could not take you. The Lord could not take your children and sell them. And as long as you carried out your duties, you could live and farm on the manor. And if your rights were threatened, sometimes serfs might refuse to work, almost like a strike. So they did have rights.